Alright, so I'm just going to give a little introduction here to what is called as the monochord. I'll turn it sideways so you can see the whole thing here in its glory. By the way, you can probably already tell that there's a little bit of delay in the video here, but hopefully you get the idea that what I'm doing here is I'm turning a tuning peg here, which is actually tightening up the tension here in this string, and therefore changing the frequency, actually by changing the speed of the wave. So remember that these are transverse waves here on a string, and even though you can't see them as moving up and down, the wave is still moving across the string back and forth, but the displacement is happening in a perpendicular direction, which qualifies this definitely as a transverse wave. I'll show you briefly how to assemble the monochord. So here's one that is unassembled here. We have a rod on one side with a hole cut through it. Some versions may have a nail or screw that's poking out through the top. And you'll also see that there's a tuning peg here that you can turn around and you can actually watch. As you turn, you can actually see that this peg here is slowly rotating. So here, I'll just kind of zoom in here. You can just see how slow that's rotating. It takes several turns for it to move. And so the catch is going to be actually that once you get this to be about at the right tension, it turns out that small motions are actually going to make a big difference in the frequency. So this is something to just be careful for, and make sure that you don't break the string. It's not the end of the world, but just please keep your eyes far away from this board, especially if you're bringing this to high tension. So we'll start with some steel string here. I'm going to cut a piece of this. You should definitely cut it longer than the actual board itself, because you're going to need a little bit of extra slack. Maybe I even cut it a little too short. You could say maybe shoot for about twice as much. You can wrap this around 2 or 3 times either direction around this thing. After so you can see here what I did is I stuck this through the center of this peg here, brought it around, make sure that it wraps around itself so that it can keep the tension, and you give it a little pull and make sure it doesn't it's not going anywhere. The next thing that we'll do is we'll put the string through the hole in the tuning peg. When I've done that here, I'm going to pull it all the way through. I'm not going to pull it super tight, but I'm just going to make it reasonably tight. In fact, if you give it a little tension with your fingers, you can already start to see that it's making some kind of sound here. So there we go. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap this around a couple of times here. I'm going to wrap it around maybe once on the outside, once on the inside, and just keep wrapping this thing around. Okay, very good. So the next thing you're going to do actually is you're going to turn the tuning peg here in a direction opposite that you were wrapping around. And so we're going to be pulling this tighter and tighter the whole time while you're pulling it here. So I'm going to be turning. I'm going to be flicking this just lightly with my finger here. So you can see that as I'm now pulling it, it's getting tighter, and as I'm getting tighter, you can actually see that now we're starting to get more crisp and repeatable tones. You don't want to over tighten it. You will actually notice that the string will start to either slip or stretch. If you over tighten it, this is about the right tension that you want for the string here. So you should get about a tone of maybe no more than about 500 hertz, maybe 550 hertz or so. If you go up higher than that, the string will be under too much tension. This is a 28 gauge wire string that I'm using, or steel wire. So, okay, so this is our monochord now, and I'm going to just give you an example of how we can record this sound using Audacity. So here's our Audacity, our old friend, and if we check to make sure that we have a mono recording, right now I will hit record, and I will give it a pluck. Okay, so I hit stop there, and I'm going to zoom in using the magnifying glass tool, and zoom in a little bit more. You can see that that is the waveform that we have. If we zoom in a little bit more, you can actually see some of the sinusoidal oscillations. I'll zoom back out, and what we're going to do is actually use the highlighter tool to highlight the whole plucking. So that's everything, maybe even a little bit more at the end there. And we'll choose Analyze, Plot Spectrum. Now, interestingly, you do see a sort of peak here, but I'm going to ask you to ignore the first big hump. Instead, what we're going to focus on is the first really narrow peak. So you're going to be looking for the first narrow peak. It turns out that this larger one is actually something that's a result of the vibrational mode of the wood itself, and we're going to ignore that. And we're going to instead look at this very first peak here. It's a prominent peak. In fact, it's the biggest one. Yours may not be bigger than this first wider one, but I want you to look for the first narrow peak. If we bring this cursor over here, you can actually see that it's at 466 hertz, which would be an A sharp on a piano. Actually, if you look here, actually, I just noticed that it tells you where the cursor is, but actually it tells you where that peak is, and so the peak is actually at 460. Which is also an A sharp, so close enough. So you'll look for that where that peak is rather than the cursor when you're recording your values. So anyway, so that's an example here. And the other thing that I'll maybe show and mention is that aside from the initial activities, we're going to be practicing to make harmonics. And so let me show you first artificially making this string shorter. Here's the original tone, and then here's making the string shorter. And so on. And if I want to make harmonics, actually you're going to use your finger, not the pen. And you're going to lightly place your finger as close as you can to halfway. And so you might actually have to use a ruler to measure the distance. So here I have a 25 centimeter length string, and so I'm going to try to pick a place that's exactly halfway in between here at 12.5. And when I pluck it, I get a frequency that's twice as loud, twice as high compared with the fundamental. And if you bring your finger over to about 1/3 of the way, you can find an even higher tone. And if you bring it over even further, to about 1/4 of the way, and you can actually find the fourth harmonic. So you'll have to practice trying to find these, but I bet you with some practice you can actually find all the way out to the fifth harmonic. I would, however, like for you to get the second harmonic and the third harmonic, and then the fourth and the fifth will be optional. All right, and I think that's everything. Just as a reminder, if you're trying to remember how to use Audacity and all of its features here, there's some parts where you'll be asked to go to the spectrogram, and we'll zoom in until we say go up to about, maybe 1,000 hertz or so. We want to see 0 down at the bottom, and we want to see about 1,000 hertz up at the top or so. And so this is the frequency spectrum that we were looking at here, and you can see that there's a peak in here that's around 450 or so, and that corresponded, if I again highlight and do a plot spectrum, that corresponded to that peak that was around 560, 558 here in the data. You might notice if you zoom out a little bit more that there's these other peaks above, and these are called harmonics. And so what we're actually seeing then is that we actually are creating other harmonics even when we just strike the fundamental. So there's these other modes, in other words, other ways of vibrating that are all happening simultaneously. This one looks to be at about twice the frequency. This one looks to be at about 5 times the frequency here. Sorry, twice the frequency, 3 times the frequency. This one here looks like 4 times the frequency, and maybe there's even one here that's at 5 times the frequency. So that's what we're playing with here. Looking at these harmonics, you can interestingly see that the harmonics are all existing even when I just pluck to the string just once. And we're going to find that by placing your finger lightly across the string, very lightly, you can actually encourage just the other modes to be playing. So I think that's it, and thank you for watching this video, and I hope it's a fun lab.